Shalom and welcome to the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're looking today at Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 12, as the Lord continues to bring his condemnation against the leaders of the people. I mentioned last time that verses 10 to 12 in chapter 8 are very similar to chapter 6, verses 12 to 15, that passage there. So our verse 12 today is going to be very similar to chapter 6, verse 15. If you want to go back and check out that video, you'd see it's not quite identical, but very, very close. Let's read the text in Hebrew as we get started. Hovishu ki toeva asu, gam bosh lo yevoshu, vahikalem lo yada'u, laken yipalu venofelim, be'et pakudatam yikashlu, amar Adonai. So what do we have here? Well, this is very similar to something, actually, it's in 6:15, but we also saw this just a little bit up, a little bit further up back in verse 9. So what we have here, this is going to be a perfect, it's going to be a third common plural, and this is a hiphil. Despite this O vowel here, this is a rather unusual form. We talked about that right back in verse 9. In verse 9, you had a hirik with a full yod in the middle, which helped to identify it as a hiphil even a little bit more easily. But this is a hiphil from the verb bosh, which means, well, it has the idea of being ashamed. Now, in the cal, it means to be ashamed. Sometimes in the hiphil, it can mean to be ashamed, but it can also have the nuance of acting shamefully in the hiphil. And you're going to see that that's going to play in a couple of different translations. Different translators will work with that a little bit differently. So that's what we have here from bosh, which is a word that's going to show up several times in this verse here. So literally, if we were to translate it just as it is, and we'll come back and talk about this, they were ashamed. And then the key, we're going to see there's some different ways of translating this word as well. But right now we'll just translate it as for, because they were ashamed for toeva, that's a word for abomination, an abominable thing they have done. So this is just a perfect third common plural, the cal from our verb asa with the final hey, which is dropped out. We're used to seeing that happen. So nothing too unusual there. This is a cal. Because they have done an abomination. And then even, this is sort of an emphatic word, even bosh, now here, this looks like the root of the verb over here. Well, it is. This is actually an infinitive absolute, and it's a cal from the verb bosh. So when you have an infinitive absolute, we're expecting some sort of repetition probably of the verb in a conjugated form, and that's what we're going to find. Being ashamed, now what do we have here? Well, this is an imperfect, and you have a yod at the beginning and an u at the end. And this also is from, and this is a cal, it's also from our verb bosh. So literally what we have is they will be ashamed, but they, in this case with the negation, they will not be ashamed. Ashamed, they will not be ashamed. And this perfect here is almost in a present sense, and this imperfect here is almost in a present sense, because it's describing the people right now. They are ashamed, but they are not at all ashamed. So we have to figure out how to deal with this, because this looks like an affirmation. This looks like a denial over here. Are they ashamed or not ashamed? Well, we'll see what the translations do with that. Vahikalem. What do we have here? This is very similar to 6:15. 6:15, you actually had another gam, this little word here, like over here, gam, at the beginning, instead of just a vav. But here we have just a vav. And what we have here is an infinitive. Back in 6:15, we had an infinitive construct, which was a hiphil. This one here, if you recognize that comments underneath, and the dagesh right here, and the hirik here, this is the form of an infinitive construct, but this time it's a nifal. And the nifal has the connotation of, again, it's a synonym of bosh, so it means to be ashamed, to perhaps to blush in humiliation. So the nifal would be they're not ashamed. They do not know how to blushing in humiliation. They have not known, or if we translate this as a present, they do not know how to blush in humiliation. So this again is just a perfect. It's a third common plural. It's a cal from our good old verb yada. So they do not know how to blush in humiliation because of what they've done, the terrible things that they've done. Therefore, there's a very strong sequential word, which is going to talk about what's going to happen as a result. They will fall. Now here we have an imperfect. Imperfect, you have a yod at the beginning, you have an u at the end. This is going to be an imperfect, it's going to be a third masculine plural, a kal from our good old verb nafal, to fall. And that nun of nafal is in that little dagish right there. It's assimilated into the dagish. So therefore, they will fall among the, so there's beit, meaning among, and there's your article there with the dagish there. And nofidim, this with that o vowel here, this is a participle. It's a masculine plural participle. Falling ones. So they will fall among the falling ones, which almost always has this connotation of the slain, those who have fallen in battle, among those who are being defeated. And in other words, this is a very strong judgment. At a time, but it's going to be at the time because it's in construct with this word over here, which is going to be definite, as we will see. So at the time of pakadatam. Well, this is a little bit different because back in 6:15 we actually had bakati, team, like this. Back in 6:15 it was a conjugated verb. It was actually a perfect, and we would have translated at the time when I visit, with the idea of punishing them, with the T, because that was an affirmative. But here we don't have that at all. What we have here is pa, ka, da, and this is just a regular word, but pakuda, from pakad again, usually with kibbutz like this, pakuda, and in this case we have the hey, which is taken a tau, so we can add the suffix to it. So pakuda means their visitation, but in the context of visiting for the purpose of punishment. So at the time of their punishment, yikashalu. Once again, we see this comments over here. Where did we see that? Over here. Remember, we saw this comments under the first radical and a dagesh in it, and a short I class vowel over here. Good indications that we're dealing with a nifal. So we have a yod at the beginning and u here. This is going to be an imperfect. It's going to be a third masculine plural, but it's going to be a nifal from the verb kashad, which means to stumble. And in the nifal, if we were to make that passive, it would, well, we wouldn't say it this way, but to be stumbled, in other words, to be thrown down. So at the time of their visitation, they will be stumbled, they will be thrown down, says Yahweh. So not too terribly difficult, a little bit unusual with a couple of nifal forms over here and a few differences from chapter 6, verse 15. Let's go ahead and hide our work here, and we'll point out some of these differences we were talking about. Let's, in the translation of what to do with this perfect as opposed to this imperfect with a negation over here. They were ashamed, and then the key, and they were not ashamed. Well, the New American Bible, not the New American Standard, but the Catholic edition, the Revised edition, takes this as a straight-out perfect. They have acted shamefully. For, which they don't translate, but it's kind of understood with the semicolon, they have done abominable things. It's an abomination, literally singular. Yet, that's how they translate the gam, they are not at all ashamed. Shaming, they are not ashamed. So this they've picked up very well. So they've just left this as a perfect and put this as a contrast over here. They've acted, so they translated this more in a passive way. They have acted shamefully. A very active way there. They do not know how to blush. With this verb over here, kalam, meaning to be ashamed or to blush. Hence, therefore, they shall be among those who fall in the time of punishment, in their time of punishment, in the time of their punishment. They move the there over to the time, but that's okay. They shall stumble, says the Lord. Okay, that makes good sense. The New Jerusalem Bible has to do something different with it. They are ashamed for, well, they say obviously that's not logical to take it straight out unless you make it a contrast. Well, they've decided to do something different. They said they should be ashamed of their loathsome deeds, of their abomination. So they've made it with this idea of this is what they should have been ashamed. There's no indication in the text that is how to translate that. There isn't a word for should, for instance, but contextually that is a possibility because you do have this clear contrast, but not they. They feel no shame. They do not even know how to blush, and so as others fall, they too will fall, will be thrown down when the time for punishing them comes, Yahweh says. So you see what they've done there. And most of our translations that we're used to seeing, like ESV and many of the others, will actually translate this as a question. Were they ashamed? And then they translated the key as a when they committed abomination. So they make this into an implied question. There's no hey interrogative over here. This is not a hey interrogative. But contextually, you could say, well, yes, in order to make some sense out of this, maybe this is a question. Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed. They did not know how to blush, therefore they shall fall among the fallen. The rest of it's pretty well straightforward. So you can see three different ways that the translators are trying to figure out what to do with this straight-out perfect, in contrast with their actual very strongly described state of not at all being ashamed. Either they have acted shamefully. Here they're translating it more in the passive sense. They should be ashamed. Were they ashamed? Which picks up these two nuances here of the hifil. This could be to be ashamed, or it could be to act shamefully. New American's gone with the first one. Most translations go with the second one, but then you have to add a word like should or make it into a question. So a little bit of a conundrum there. That's a technical aspect. What the important thing for us to remember here is that the Lord wants us to feel this humiliation. When we're not going to live our lives perfectly before Him, but when we do, we pray that the Lord would give us sensitive consciences to be quick to respond, quick to feel our shame and our humiliation when we've done wrong, and to come back to Him and find that forgiveness. Well, kind of a hard verse here as we looked at it. Check back with us soon as we'll continue working in Jeremiah 8 in the weekend edition of the Daily Dose of Hebrew. Shalom.